Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer Sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Welcome, Fun Chat enthusiasts. We are happy that you've joined us, and whether you have been watching our YouTube channel for the 32 previous Fun Chats we've had, or if this is your first time, we're so grateful that you're here, because we know that the conversations that Jackie and I have with our guests will help open the doors of freshness to the 1950s and what happened in the lives of people all throughout the country. You know, Jackie, what happened in our lives in the 1950s is not necessarily what happened in the lives of other folks. And I think we can learn this today, too, with our guest who grew up in Texas. But before we get to that point where we introduce him, why don't you do some homework for us, please?
I will do some housekeeping for you, and that is, viewers, please, as you're perusing our screen, take a look on the bottom, and you'll find a banner that has our website, www.whilethewindmillwatch.com. It is a website that has many points of information about vendors, about ourselves, about the book, some things we hope you find interesting. Also, as you're perusing, look at the upper right-hand corner. You'll see a beautiful North Dakota sunset that wraps around the cover of our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s. Now, this book includes so many memories Janine and I have of living on the northern Great Plains in the 50s. And you'll notice, please, on the lower right-hand corner of that little book, there's a little medallion. And this little medallion was bestowed upon us a couple of weeks ago. It is the 2022 Independent Press Award in the category of regional as a distinguished favorite. Now, regional refers to the book being written about a certain area, about a region, and that's exactly what we did. Now, I really am excited, though, about introducing our guest. His name is Harry Hillaker, and Harry Hillaker was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1956, and he's the youngest of 6 children. His dad was an aeronautical engineer, and his mom a full-time mom. As a child, Harry's interests were baseball, maps, dreaming of travel, statistics, and weather. He left home in 1974 and attended the University of Texas in Austin, where he earned a degree in geography in 1978. He furthered his education by receiving a master's degree in geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he taught climatology and geomorphology classes for 4 semesters. I hope I pronounced that right. If not, please correct me, Harry.
You got it right.
Harry and his wife, Michelle, have 8 children and 11 grandchildren. So welcome, Harry, to the 1950s Fun Chat. We're so glad to have you here.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Good. It'll be a fun one. Harry, you have extensive knowledge of a very broad area of geography. So what was your main interest in this broad world of geography, and where has it taken you?
Well, basically, when I was a kid, I always dreamed of traveling, and never got to do much of it growing up. But so I was always collecting maps. My dad traveled a lot with his job, and he'd always bring me maps back of places he went, and I'd study the maps and dream of going there someday. And eventually, after went to college and got married later, and have gotten to do a lot of traveling. And but as far as interests go, maps were my main interest going into college. But it didn't take very long that figured out climatology or weather was of more interest, and that became more of my specialty as I went through college. And what my master's thesis dealt with was climate. In that case, climate of Texas. But since then, I've been in Iowa for over 40 years now, and definitely know way more about Iowa climate than any other state at this point.
So, Harry, I have to know, did you score off the charts in the map skills segment of the Iowa Basic Skills when you were a
Yes, definitely did. In fact, one teacher I had back in fifth grade decided I must have had a photographic memory, but it's stuff I actually already knew. Something I taught in class and already knew all the information.
Sure.
Yeah.
So that reputation went around for a few years, but no, I don't really have a photographic memory. It's just a subject I like a lot.
Okay.
Well, what stimulated your interest in climatology? And what's the difference in climatology and weather forecasting?
The difference kind of is sometimes unclear. In fact, my predecessor as state climatologist in Iowa was actually trained as a meteorologist. My background is strictly climatology, which is more dealing with weather trends, weather statistics, and what's been happening over the long term. And it's not doesn't generally involve forecasting, although there is an aspect of climatology that does very long range forecasting about months and years and so forth. But my thing is definitely just in the statistics of it all, kind of like a weather librarian in a way. And so that's what my job was for much of the last 40 years. And how I became interested in it was when I was 7.5 years old, January 14th, 1964. We had a full-fledged blizzard in my hometown of Fort Worth, Texas.
Oh, my goodness.
And we had 14 inches of snow. I still recall measuring it in my neighbor's front yard because we had a better spot to measure there. And I was young enough, I didn't know that didn't happen very often. In fact, it's never happened before, and it's never happened since in Fort Worth, but it happened then. And that really got me hooked on the weather. And we happened to have a TV meteorologist in town who was very educational, I should say. And I made sure I watched the weather, which came on about 6:12 in the evening and about 10:12 at night. And I'd be watching that every single day. And of course, back then, before internet, before cable, all these other things, if you missed it, you just missed the broadcast. So I had to watch TV, make sure I was there ready for that weather broadcast when it came up. And just a whole bunch of things happened. About a few months later, we had a terrible hailstorm and basically destroyed my dad's little Fiat convertible that he had. And then saw my first tornado when I would have been sixth grade. I was at recess at school outside and looked up, and there was virtually a funnel right above me. You could look up into the funnel, and it didn't look all that eerie. It wasn't real dark out, but it was a tornado, and it eventually touched down. But unfortunately, I had to go inside and hide in the hall and all that stuff. So I was kind of disappointed I missed what happened, but fortunately, it didn't hit the school and didn't cause any damage. But there just seemed like there was one thing after another that just kept my weather interest going.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that is really cool. And could you in your later years in the more association and more studying that you had in the area of climatology, could you associate that winter storm, that solo winter storm in Texas, with anything in particular in the area, that particular area? Are there associations that are involved with the climatology and what actually happens on the ground?
Yeah, on that one, not really. It's just one of those kind of quirky little things. I think where I was at was almost where the most snow actually occurred in that storm. Every storm has its center where you get the most snow or the most rain, whatever. That one happened to be centered right over where I lived. And so it's just kind of one of those quirky little things. And never had anything like that. In fact, even after living in Iowa for about 15, 20 years, it took that long before we had a storm that big here in one snowfall. Although back in Texas, it was pretty much all gone within 48 hours. There was no snow left of that one. Very different than Iowa or North Dakota, where you grew up, where that snow, once it comes, doesn't go away. But in Texas, it doesn't last long. So it was a fleeting enjoyment for me at the time.
Good.
What do you recall what you saw when looking up inside that funnel cloud?
Not really, but it was, not a really big storm, especially dark out, but just looked up and like, whoa, you can see this rotation up in the sky above, almost directly above. And eventually apparently touched down about a mile away.
Okay.
But it was a very weak one as far as tornadoes go. And I managed to see, I guess, 4 other tornadoes over the next 5 or 6 years. Always seem to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not one of those people that likes to go storm chasing and find tornadoes. They just always seem to find me. And that's been the case, ever since. But the worst one was actually going to a trip to New Mexico and Colorado one summer, and there was a tornado on the ground, a rather strong one, and we were stuck out in the middle of nowhere in far west Texas, nowhere to go, and all of a sudden it started raining so hard you couldn't see the drive to get away from it. We were just sitting there in the car, like expecting to get blown away any second, but all of a sudden it cleared, the storm was gone, and we lived to tell about it afterwards. But
my goodness, was your car shaking and acting like it wanted to turn over?
Fortunately not. It wasn't super bad other than very heavy rain. It wasn't that scary of a storm. It was scary because we knew it was coming our direction, but apparently it went just far enough away that we didn't have any direct impact from it.
If you had those interests as a child, what did your schoolmates, did they share some of those same interests as you did in geography and maps? And
no, I think they just thought it was pretty nerdy, I think, for the most part. Although nerdy wasn't a word back in that time period. But I had very different interests, and I like statistics, like just keeping track of numbers and so forth. And so it's kind of different. Ended up having a best friend, being my roommate in college and all of that, who was an excellent student. I really never was a very good student, at least up to that point. And I learned a lot from him, and he learned a lot from me. And so it all worked out.
Good.
Yeah. Good. So when I was reading the information you sent, Harry, I was reminded of Dr. Seuss phrase, "Oh, the places you'll go." So could you please attempt to tell us about some of those places you've been and some of the outstanding memories that you have?
Yeah, basically, once as a child, when I was 8 years old, we did a trip to Michigan, a road trip from Fort Worth up to Michigan. And that was the first time I'd ever even been practically out of my county I grew up in. And I had just a bazillion memories from that one. It was just such a neat experience. And I was already into maps, so I was actually following maps. I could tell exactly where we were as we were going up there and so forth. And so that was a very memorable one, just because it was so unique and done anything like that before. But since then, there's been 2 trips that really stand out. One was in 2007. Had to stop and think which year it was. And we went my wife and I flew to Vietnam to adopt our 8th child. And that was just the strangest experience being there. Because I grew up during the Vietnam War era. And remember, I was always watching the news just so I wouldn't forget and miss the weather report at 6:12 in the evening. And so I knew, I was following that, just by habit, seeing the news and seeing all the news about Vietnam. And I never dreamed I'd be, 40 years later, whatever, how long it was, 50 years later, that I'd be walking the streets in Hanoi, and actually went to the Hanoi Hilton, where the infamous prisoner of war camp there. And it was just the strangest thing. And just culturally, just such a very different place. And that was quite an unusual experience. And the second trip was the reason I retired. I retired at 61, earlier than I planned on. Was 2 of my kids were going on a trip to Europe to go hiking, and they'd already done this once before, and I couldn't take off that much time from work. So this time I thought, I'm not going to miss this trip. So I retired so I could take 6 weeks off. And we walked from about 600 miles from southern France to the northwest corner of Spain.
Oh my.
And we've had four of my kids. One of my grandson, who was only 8 months old at the time, he didn't walk it. He got carried the whole way. But it was quite the experience. And weather-wise, it rained 27 of the 37 days we were walking.
Oh no!
Really tired of mud and rain and all that stuff. But we made it. Had a lot of mostly good memories from that, and would really love to do that again.
How, Harry, how long did it take you to make that journey?
We actually were walking for 37 days to get that 600 miles. And we had a few issues along the way where, well, first of all, we had a train strike that we couldn't get to our starting point for 2 days. So, and then once we got walking, the very first night, we could not find a place to stay. And we thought we'd be sleeping on a porch of somebody's house or and all that stuff. But fortunately, the small little town in France, the mayor went to a pharmacy. It was the only business open in town, and the pharmacist called the mayor and said, "Is there someplace this family of 8 people can stay at?" And he opened up the public works building. We slept on the floor, and even brought us breakfast the next morning. So it was one of those things that was a bad situation at the time, but it was a good memory looking back on it.
Sure. Sure.
Very.
Harry, were your parents interested in weather, or what was the occupation of your parents?
Yeah, my dad was as an aeronautical engineer. He was just absolutely nuts about airplanes. He was kind of like I was with weather and maps growing up. He was with airplanes, and he grew up born in 1919, and I think he flew an airplane. Flew in an airplane like so like 12 years old, something like that, and that really hooked him on it. Went to college, University of Michigan Aeronautical School. Never graduated because the war came along, and he ended up working as an aeronautical engineer, even though he didn't have his degree yet. And over the years, he was actually at the age of 25 was what do they call it? He was in charge of basically, I can't remember the term for it now all of a sudden, but basically new design ideas, I guess is what it was. And he eventually designed a lot of different airplanes over the years.
Okay.
Did that his whole life. And my mom was always the stay-at-home mom for the most part. And she put up with me all those years. I don't know how, but anyway, it was a very good childhood though.
Wonderful. Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell me how many different cloud formations there are now? Because it seems like when I was studying, we had geography in grammar school, and I don't think there were as many as there are now. Is that true? Have they created?
Well, there's basically traditionally kind of 3 different cloud types that we speak of. Lower clouds, which are typically cumulus, middle level clouds like stratus, and upper level clouds like cirrus, the ice crystal clouds. Those kind of 3 basic categories, but there's just a bazillion, infinite number of combinations of those. And so, yeah, it does get, over the years, there's, I don't know how many official names of different cloud types there are anymore. I'm sure there's at least 5 or 6 dozen of them, but there's probably more than that, of all kinds of different types of clouds that are combinations of those 3 basic categories.
Okay. All right. Because I have seen a list of cloud formations, and that was much more than I think we learned, maybe 5 or 7. I don't know. That's 4th grade is a long time ago.
Yes. That's one thing I was disappointed of. In the public schools I went to in Texas, we never had a geography class. That's the subject I really liked, but we didn't have it back then. At least where I was at.
Yes, yes.
We outstanding country school, and as we talk more about our school life and compare it to others and their young primary school, we're just heads above. We were so fortunate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Then, Harry, what really moved you forward in life and to be in the Iowa State Climatologist? And what were your responsibilities with that job?
Yeah, basically, it's a very small office that's part of the state agriculture department in Iowa,
Okay.
which works a little differently than most states in that we have a Iowa Secretary. God, I can't even say the word. Iowa Secretary of Agriculture, which in Iowa is actually an elected position. So
Hmm.
you're elected to that position. It's not appointed by the governor or anything like that, and so a bit different in that way. But I'd actually not even, despite all my background, I didn't know there was such a thing as a state climatologist. And even through college, that was a new thing to me. But I was driving around Des Moines after I first moved here, and I saw the sign that said, I thought it said state meteorologist. I read the sign wrong. It actually said state metrologist, which
Well,
has to do with weights and measures. And but I looked up in the phone book when you had phone books, and found that it was actually a climatologist. And so, oh, so that's something I needed to find out about. And so I called them up on the phone and met with them and sent them my resume. And they said, well, there's only a 2-person office at the time. And they said, well, we'll keep your resume, and if anything comes up, we'll let you know. And 6 months later, which was 2 weeks after I got married, I got a phone call from the state climatologist saying, I've got this 3-month long research grant available. Would you be interested? And I was like, oh, boy, I'm very
yeah.
interested. I've been unemployed for the previous 6 months, which probably worried my in-laws, especially that we just got married and have a job. But that was back in 1981, early 80s, when the farm crisis was going on. The economy wasn't too great in Iowa, wasn't a place to be, and so I was very fortunate to get that job. And 3 months later, another grant came along, then another one, another one, another one, and finally I was there for about 7 years. And the previous state climatologist retired, and it's a long story, but I won't get into all of that. But eventually, I was the acting state climatologist till they hired a new one,
Hmm.
and then ended up never interviewing all the people that applied for the job. And then finally said, "Would you want this job?" Sure. Yeah. So that's how it came into having it. And I was actually state climatologist for just over 30 years, and really liked it. Basically, just keeping track of what's going on. And we had uh, those kind of trial by fire at the beginning. 1988 was my first year, which of course we had a big drought year all across the Plains states and especially Iowa. And so it was a huge amount of work. I was getting, just sometimes I would stay at work overnight and just work through the night and do another work day the next day, just trying to keep up with all the news media calls and things like that,
Hmm.
and explaining, kind of put things in perspective. When was it last this hot? When was it last this dry? What's the prognosis? What's going to happen from here on out? That sort of thing. So it was a very, very busy time. And
So,
so that was mostly what I'd be doing, was be, explaining what's going on,
okay.
what's likely to happen.
So your responsibilities were to do the, as the climatologist, the state climatologist, were to do the research, figure out what was going to happen to the best of your knowledge, and then pass that information on to the news media so that they could in turn share it with the public.
Yes.
Okay. I
Yes.
remember hearing you on the radio many times in Iowa and talking about the climate and what can happen and what had happened in the past. But tell me, Harry, because the climate was such as it was in, for instance, what you said in the early 80s in Iowa, was it that way throughout the entire country?
Yeah, generally with it varies a lot, and so typically when somebody's experiencing a drought like we were in Iowa in '88, it almost always means someone else is getting a lot of rain. And I can't recall
Sure.
now, looking way back, where the other place was that was getting the rain. But drought tends to be more widespread, unlike flooding events and things like that, which could be very localized. And but drought tends to be a very widespread phenomena. Also tends to last quite some time as well. And then wasn't all that many years later, we had 1993, which I know was a very wet year up in North Dakota as well. But in Iowa was by far the wettest year of the historical record, and just amazing amount of flooding that was going on. And it's like, is this ever going to end? Unfortunately, it did end. 93 was the last of a series of very wet years at that point. But just pretty amazing what things have occurred over that time period.
With in going back to the 50s era, the late 50s, early 60s, do you recall, and I know you were so young then, but do you recall anything particular about your climate in Texas where you grew up?
Well, not a whole lot, although it was always hot, it seemed like to me.
Uh, Hotter than
And
normal?
yeah, always seemed hot. And our house was actually my parents' dream house. They designed it themselves, had it built in 1954. They had a bedroom for every child. And then I came along in 56, so they weren't expecting me. So I had to share a room with my brother. And but the house was actually built with air conditioning,
Oh,
but we never had it turned on. I didn't realize it worked, but it was just a money saving thing. We never had the air conditioning on growing up. And
Huh.
So I just dreaded summer and the hot weather and all that. But that's, of course, all I really knew. But so I mainly just remember how hot things were. I remember it was one birthday, it was my 15th birthday, where we had a record low temperature that morning. It got down to 69 degrees on July 30th, my birthday. So for the low temperature. And so, and that seemed just like, like almost winter-like to me after typical summer-like weather.
well,
But generally the 50s themselves, really through much of the country, especially the Plain States eastward, was a very hot. The middle part of that decade, we had some very hot summers, and also drought was very widespread. The early, say like 1952, 53, up to about 56 or so. Not just in Iowa, but I think much of the Plain States were the same way. And but interesting enough is the late 50s, starting with 57, 58, in that ballpark, that the weather pattern started turning much wetter. And in Iowa, it's just been getting, for the most part, wetter still since that time period. We've never really had a very extended period of drought ever since then. The 50s were dry, 30s much worse, both Iowa and North Dakota. But since then, the droughts have been much more, some of them pretty intense, but much more short-lived than what we saw in the earlier decades of the
we know
19th century, 20th century.
we note in our book, and Jackie, you note about there was a year in the 50s. Do you recall which year where mom and dad sat you down ahead of Christmas and said that there wouldn't be many
Christmas,
Christmas gifts this year because just
1957.
okay, all right. And we were a farm family, and so it hit us hard that way too.
It's amazing how things have changed as far as just agricultural practices as well as the weather changing. That
Right.
things are so much different now than they were than back then.
Yes. Well, Harry, we're getting close to the end of our broadcast, and there are always two questions I like to ask each guest. The first one is, what is a fun memory that you have of the 1950s decade?
Oddly enough, there's only, I think we mentioned this before doing an interview, is the only thing I actually specifically remember, because I was not born until July of 56.
Okay.
But the only thing I specifically remember in the 50s was my third birthday. And I was with my mom, as usual, and we had gone to the neighborhood bakery, which mostly did bread and all that, but we're really known for desserts and cakes and things of that nature. And so he got my birthday cake. And driving home, I remember sitting in the front seat of our 55 Ford station wagon. And my mom was driving. I was sitting in the middle of the front seat. Of course, back then there was no such thing as seatbelts hadn't been
Right.
weren't in use back then. So my mom's right arm was the seatbelt, holding in case we decided to stop, that sort of thing. But as we were sitting there in the front seat, going down West 7th Street in Fort Worth, back home, playing with three little train pieces that were going to be the topping on the cake. And I still remember that like it just happened yesterday. But that's the only memory I specifically have for that in 1959.
Sure.
What I have of that decade.
That's awesome. And then the other question that I ask is, what from the 1950s, or even in your childhood, influenced your life as an adult?
Well, it's hard to say. So many things. I think one is, just looking back on it, is so fortunate to have a very good family and great parents and lots of siblings to grow up with. I was the youngest of them all, so they always said I was the spoiled one. which I probably was, and but I enjoyed that, I guess. But it was a very good time to grow up in, and just things are so different. I still remember, uh, at school we were in, fast growing city, and this elementary school went to had 600 students, and just
Mhm.
elementary school grades, kindergarten through sixth grade. And I think there was only one family I knew of where there's a girl in the class whose parents had been divorced. That was just unheard of back then. It seemed like, I mean, that happened, but it was just such a rare thing, and so different from what it is today, where divorce is so common, and
Yes.
single parent families are such a common thing. But I was very fortunate to grow up in the environment that I did.
Yes, yes. Jackie and I can attest to that too. We had a wonderful upbringing by our parents. And folks, our guest today has been Harry Hillaker, originally from the state of Texas, but became an Iowan and was the Iowa State climatologist and is now retired. We thank you, Harry. This has been delightful. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you.
much for joining us today.
Fun.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Yes. And until our next week's fun chat, we hope that you think about the days of the 50s. And maybe those days included soda jerks or cool cars or poodle skirts or even a wonderful family life, such as what Harry lived.
Yes. So do join us next week, and we'd like to have you, if you would, press that red subscribe button and press the thumbs up button so we know you're there, and tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. So do join us every week. This broadcast will be live 8 o'clock Central Time on Monday evening. And if you can't view it at that time, it'll be on our YouTube channel after that. So we do hope you'll join us. And anything else you want to say, Janine?
Yes, if you want to learn more about the Pfeiffer Sisters and more about our award-winning book, just travel on over to our website, www.whilethewindmillwatch.com, and you'll get a little history lesson about Jackie and me. There's nothing on there about the climatology aspect, though, at that time, but you will get a little history lesson. You'll find out where all of our vendors are, who's to sell our book. And also, if you just want to order a book right there, you can. You can just click on that, and the order goes through to the NDSU bookstore, and they will ship that book out to you or to any of your friends and relatives or whoever you want to share the book with. Also, now our website features a tab on the homepage that's called the 1950s Fun Chat. So usually by the day after the broadcast goes live, it will be posted onto our website, and you can see all of the past fun chats that we have recorded then and there, along with the same opportunity on our YouTube channel, the 1950s Fun Chat. So thanks so much for joining us today. We are just hoping to see you again next time. So until then, bye-bye.